The doors of the great hall swung open with a crash, and every head in the room turned at once. Alira stood frozen at the entrance, still wearing her traveling cloak, snow melting from its edges onto the polished floor. She had been summoned without warning, pulled from her chambers by 2 guards who would not meet her eyes. Now she understood why. King Alden sat on his high seat, his face hard as stone, and beside him stood a woman Alira had never seen before, dressed in fine blue silk, a circlet already resting on her brow. "You stand accused of failing this kingdom," the king said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. 3 years of marriage, and you have given me nothing, no heir, no hope. I release you from this union, effective today, before every noble in this court." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Alira felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stay upright. "Your Majesty," she said quietly, "we have never once spoken of children. You have barely spoken to me at all." Laughter broke out from somewhere near the back, quickly stifled. The king's jaw tightened. "Do not embarrass yourself further," he said. "Guards, remove her title. She may keep the clothes on her back and nothing more." Alira looked at the woman in blue silk, who did not look away, did not even blink, only smiled faintly, as if she had been waiting a long time for this moment. Something about that smile felt wrong, though Alira could not say why. "Who is she?" Alira asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Lady Muriel," the king answered, "soon to be your replacement. You will address her with respect, even as you leave." Alira did not bow. She simply turned, walked back down the long aisle between the nobles who had once flattered her at feasts, and now would not meet her gaze, and stepped out into the cold. Behind her, she heard murmurs rising like a wave, delighted whispers about the fallen wife, the barren bride, the woman cast aside like an old coat. None of them knew her. None of them had ever tried. Outside, the guards did not offer her a horse or a carriage. She walked through the palace gates on foot, past servants who pretended not to notice her, past the fountain, where she used to sit and read in quieter days. The city beyond the gates blurred through unshed tears, but she refused to let them fall where anyone could see. She had nowhere grand to go, only the memory of an old family estate 2 days' ride to the east, a crumbling manor she had not visited since she was a girl. It belonged to her mother's side of the family, forgotten by everyone except an aging nurse named Greta, who still tended it out of loyalty rather than duty. By the time Alira reached the edge of the city, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky the color of a fresh bruise. A merchant recognized her from the court and offered her a ride in his cart, more out of curiosity than kindness, peppering her with questions she refused to answer. She sat in silence, watching the towers of the palace shrink behind her, thinking of the smile on Lady Muriel's face. It was not the smile of a woman who had simply fallen in love with a king. It was the smile of someone who had won something long fought for. The journey to the estate took longer than she remembered. The roads were worse, the villages poorer, the winter colder than any she recalled from childhood. When she finally arrived, the manor looked smaller than in her memories, its stone walls dark with age, ivy creeping up toward shuttered windows. Greta opened the door before Alira even reached it, as though she had been watching the road for days. "I heard," the old woman said simply, pulling Alira inside out of the wind. "News travels faster than shame, it seems." "Faster than anything," Alira murmured. That first night, she sat by a small fire in a room that smelled of dust and old wood, and she allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not for the king, whom she had never truly loved, their marriage arranged for reasons of land and alliance rather than affection. She cried for the years spent trying to be useful in a court that never wanted her, for the friendships that evaporated the moment her title did, for the uncertainty of what a discarded noblewoman was supposed to become. Greta did not try to comfort her with false promises. She simply sat nearby, mending a torn shawl by candlelight, letting the silence do what words could not. "You still remember the old ways," Greta said eventually, not quite a question. Alira wiped her eyes. "The healing? A little. Grandmother taught me before I was sent to court. I haven't practiced in years." "Might be worth remembering," Greta said. "Out here, physicians are a luxury. We look after our own." Alira managed a small, tired smile. It was the first genuine one in weeks. The following days settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Illyra helped Greta with small chores around the estate, relearning tasks she had once considered beneath her station, drawing water from the well, mending fences, sorting dried herbs in the pantry. It should have felt like a humiliation, this descent from palace halls to a leaking roof and a garden gone wild. Instead, she found an odd comfort in it. No one here whispered behind her back. No one here smiled at her the way Lady Muriel had smiled. She thought of that smile often, turning it over in her mind the way one turns over a strange coin, looking for the mark that reveals its true value. Word from the capital reached the estate slowly, carried by traveling merchants, and the occasional letter from a cousin who still dared to write to her. The first letter, arriving nearly a month after her banishment, spoke only of the wedding preparations already underway for the king and Lady Muriel, a ceremony planned with unusual haste for a kingdom that normally took a full year to plan a royal wedding. Illyra read the letter twice by candlelight, frowning at the timeline. Such urgency was unusual, even for a king eager to remarry. She folded the letter and placed it in a drawer, telling herself it was none of her concern any longer. But the questions lingered, the way a splinter lingers beneath the skin, small and easy to ignore, until the moment it is pressed. Weeks passed. The manor slowly came back to life under Illyra's attention, and something in her began to heal alongside it. She started walking the nearby woods in the mornings, gathering the same herbs her grandmother once used, remembering names and uses she thought she had forgotten: willow bark for fever, chamomile for sleep, elderflower for the lungs. Each small memory felt like recovering a piece of herself that the court had slowly stripped away. It was on one such morning, gathering herbs near the edge of the forest, that she met a traveling healer named Corin, a young man passing through with a satchel of tinctures and a reputation for treating illnesses that confused the trained physicians of the region. He had heard, vaguely, of a disgraced noblewoman living at the old estate, and curiosity had brought him to her door under the pretense of asking for water. They spoke for an hour about herbs and remedies, and Illyra found herself surprised by how easily the conversation flowed, how good it felt to discuss something other than her own misfortune. Corin mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had recently traveled through the capital and heard troubling rumors from a friend who worked in the royal kitchens. "They say the king has taken ill," Corin said, tucking a bundle of dried mint into his satchel. "Nothing the physicians can explain, tremors in his hands, nightmares so severe the guards hear him crying out from the hallway." Illyra felt something cold settle in her stomach, though she could not immediately say why. "When did this begin?" she asked, trying to keep her voice light. Corin thought for a moment. "A few weeks after the wedding, I believe. Perhaps sooner. The details vary depending on who tells the story. A few weeks after the wedding, a few weeks after Lady Muriel became queen." Illyra said nothing more on the subject, thanking Corin for the news and returning to her chores, as though the conversation meant nothing. But that night, long after Greta had gone to bed, she found herself standing in the small study at the back of the manor, staring at a locked cabinet she had not opened since childhood. Her grandmother's journals were kept there, dozens of them, filled with notes on remedies, illnesses, and older knowledge that the court physicians dismissed as superstition. Illyra had never taken them seriously as a girl, more interested in dresses and dances than dusty pages of folk medicine. Now, for reasons she could not quite explain, she found herself reaching for the key. The cabinet creaked open, releasing the smell of old paper and dried lavender. Rows of leather-bound journals lined the shelves, each labeled in her grandmother's careful handwriting. Illyra ran her fingers along the spines, searching without quite knowing what she searched for, until one title caught her eye, tucked near the back, written in ink so faded it was barely legible: "Bindings and Sickness of the Blood." She pulled it free and carried it to the small desk by the window, lighting a second candle against the growing dark. The pages inside were older than the others, the handwriting different, belonging perhaps to her grandmother's own mother. They spoke of illnesses that no physician could name, sicknesses that came without warning and worsened with time, tied not to poison in the body, but to something hidden nearby, an object bound with intention to weaken or destroy. Illyra read late into the night, her candle burning low, a strange unease building with every page. The symptoms described in the journal, tremors, nightmares, a slow wasting of strength, matched almost exactly what Corin had described of the king's condition. It could be nothing. Illness took many forms, and coincidence was common enough. And yet, she closed the journal and sat in the dark for a long moment, listening to the wind move through the old trees outside, thinking again of Lady Muriel's smile on the day of her banishment. A smile of victory, a smile of someone who had gotten exactly what she wanted. Illyra did not sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning over the pieces of a puzzle she had not asked to solve, a puzzle that led, again and again, back toward the palace she had been thrown out of only weeks before. By morning, she had made a decision she would not have believed herself capable of making a month earlier. She would learn more, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention. Whatever was happening in that palace, whatever illness had taken hold of the king who had humiliated her before the entire court, she needed to understand it. Not for his sake, not yet, but because the fear building in her chest told her this was no ordinary sickness, and something told her that the truth, whatever it was, would not stay hidden for long. She rose before dawn, dressed in the plainest clothes the estate could offer, and began, for the first time since her banishment, to plan. The road back toward the capital was longer than Illyra remembered, or perhaps it only felt that way because every mile carried her closer to a place that had cast her out with such cruelty. She traveled alone at first, wrapped in a plain wool cloak that hid her face from curious travelers, carrying only a small satchel with bread, water, and her grandmother's journal wrapped carefully in cloth. Greta had argued against the journey for 2 full days before finally giving up, seeing the same stubborn look in Illyra's eyes that she remembered from Illyra's mother years before. "If you must go," Greta had said, pressing a small pouch of dried herbs into her hands, "at least go prepared. Willow bark for pain, feverfew for the mind, and this." She held up a small vial of dark liquid. "For clearing poison from the body, if it comes to that. Use it sparingly. It is bitter and unkind to the stomach." Illyra had thanked her, and tucked the vial deep into her satchel, though she prayed she would never need it. The first sign that something was truly wrong came not from the palace itself, but from the villages along the road leading to it. Illyra stopped at a small inn 2 days from the capital, hoping to rest before continuing, and found the common room buzzing with talk of the king's condition. Farmers who had never set foot near the palace gates spoke with confident authority about tremors that shook the king's entire body, about screams heard through stone walls thick enough to muffle almost anything. "They say he can't hold a spoon anymore," one man muttered over his ale. "Hands shake too bad, had to be fed like a babe at the last feast." "That's not the worst of it," said another, lowering his voice, as though the words themselves were dangerous. "My cousin works the stables near the palace. Says the guards whisper about strange marks appearing on the king's skin at night, gone by morning, like something touches him while he sleeps." Illyra sat quietly in the corner, nursing a cup of watered wine, listening carefully, without appearing to listen at all. Marks that appeared and vanished. Nightmares. Tremors with no clear cause. Every detail matched, piece by piece, the descriptions in her grandmother's journal of a binding illness, a sickness caused not by nature, but by intention. She left the inn before dawn the next morning, moving faster now, driven by an urgency she did not fully understand herself. Was she doing this out of concern for a man who had humiliated her before the entire court? Or was it something else, a need to understand the truth, to prove to herself that she had not imagined the strange coldness behind Lady Muriel's smile? Perhaps it did not matter which reason drove her. Both led her to the same road, the same destination. By the time the towers of the capital rose against the horizon, familiar and unwelcoming all at once, Illyra had already decided she could not simply walk through the front gates as herself. A disgraced former wife requesting entry to see the king who had cast her aside would be turned away before she finished speaking, or worse, arrested for disturbing the peace of the court. She needed another way in. Memory served her well here. Years at court had taught her more about the palace than most nobles ever bothered to learn, including the smaller servant entrances used by kitchen staff and laundry workers, Gates rarely watched closely, because no one of importance ever used them. She spent a full day in the city first, using coins from her dwindling purse to purchase plain servant's clothes from a second-hand merchant, and cutting her long hair shorter with a borrowed knife, transforming herself, as much as possible, into someone unremarkable. The disguise would not survive close inspection, but it did not need to. It only needed to get her through the gate. That evening, as the sun sank low and the kitchen staff began their evening rush of deliveries and errands, Elara joined a small group of workers carrying baskets of linens toward the servants' entrance on the eastern side of the palace. Her heart pounded so loudly she feared the guard at the gate might hear it, but he barely glanced up from his post, waving the group through with practiced disinterest. Inside, the palace felt both familiar and strange, its halls the same stone corridors she had once walked as a wife of the king, yet now viewed from an entirely different angle, low and hidden, a servant among servants, rather than a noblewoman among nobles. She could not simply walk toward the king's chambers. Guards stood posted at every major intersection, and any unfamiliar face wandering too close to royal quarters would draw immediate suspicion. Instead, she followed the flow of servants toward the kitchens, hoping to gather information before deciding on her next move. The kitchen was chaos, as it always had been, cooks shouting over boiling pots, servers rushing trays toward the dining halls, the air thick with the smell of roasted meat and fresh bread. Elara busied herself, folding linens near a corner, close enough to overhear conversation, without drawing attention to herself. It did not take long before she heard what she needed. Two young kitchen maids stood near the ovens, speaking in hushed, worried tones, as they waited for a tray of bread to finish baking. "I heard the Queen dismissed another physician today," one girl said. "The fourth this month. Says none of them understand the illness properly." "Maybe none of them do," the other replied. "My uncle serves in the guard near the royal chambers. Says the Queen won't let anyone near the king's private study, not even the physicians, unless she is present. Keeps the door locked herself most nights. Strange, don't you think? A new wife so protective of a sick husband, and yet so quick to turn away help." The first girl shrugged. "Grief makes people strange, or perhaps she simply does not trust the physicians. Can you blame her? None of them have helped." Elara kept her head down, folding the same linen twice, her mind racing. A locked study, guarded from physicians, controlled entirely by the new queen. If her grandmother's journal was correct, a binding illness required a physical object, something hidden nearby to maintain its hold over the victim. A locked room, kept private even from those meant to heal the king, would be the perfect place to conceal such a thing. She needed to see that room, but a servant folding linens had no reason to enter the royal study, and any attempt to sneak inside uninvited would end her mission before it truly began. She spent the rest of the evening moving carefully through the palace, gathering whatever small pieces of information she could without drawing suspicion, memorizing guard rotations, watching which servants were trusted enough to enter the private wing of the palace, and which were kept firmly at a distance. It was well past midnight, the palace quiet except for the occasional footsteps of a night guard, when Elara found herself standing near the edge of the physician's quarters, a modest set of rooms where the court's healers slept and worked when not attending patients. A single candle burned in one window, and through the gap in the curtain, Elara could see a young man hunched over a table covered in notes, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Something about his expression, the genuine distress, rather than the careful blankness worn by most palace staff, made Elara pause. This was not a man simply performing his duties. This was someone who cared, and who was afraid. Before she could think better of it, she found herself knocking softly on the door. The young man startled, nearly knocking over his candle, and opened the door only a crack, staring at her with wary suspicion. "Who are you? Servants aren't permitted in this wing after dark. I need to speak with you," Elara said quietly, choosing her words with care. "About the king's illness. I believe I may understand something the other physicians have missed." The man's eyes narrowed, exhaustion warring with curiosity. "You're no physician, just a maid, judging by your clothes. Appearances can be misleading," Elara said. "Please, 5 minutes. If you find nothing useful in what I say, I will leave and never trouble you again." He hesitated a long moment, glancing down the empty hallway behind her, before finally stepping aside and allowing her into the small, cluttered room. "My name is Corin," he said, closing the door behind her and lowering his voice. "Apprentice to the royal physicians, for whatever good that title is worth these days. Speak quickly. If anyone finds you here, we will both face trouble." Illyra blinked in surprise. "Corin? I met a traveling healer by that name, weeks ago, near an estate to the east." The young man frowned, studying her more closely in the dim candlelight, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of recognition slowly dawning. "You're the healer from the estate," he said slowly. "The one who asked so many questions about herbs. But that was—" His eyes widened as he finally placed her face beneath the short hair and plain clothes. "You're the king's former wife, Illyra." "Please," she said quickly, glancing toward the door. "Keep your voice down. I did not come here to cause trouble. I came because I believe I know what is truly happening to the king, and I fear it is far more dangerous than illness." Corin stared at her for a long, tense moment, clearly weighing the risk of listening to a disgraced noblewoman who had somehow infiltrated the palace disguised as a servant, against the desperation of a man who had watched his king suffer for weeks without answers. Finally, he gestured toward a small chair near his cluttered desk. "Sit," he said quietly. "Tell me everything, and it had better be worth the risk we are both taking." Illyra sat, pulled her grandmother's journal from beneath her cloak, and began to speak, choosing her words carefully, watching Corin's face shift from skepticism to something far more troubled as she described the binding illness detailed in the old pages, and how closely its symptoms matched everything he had witnessed in the king's chambers. By the time she finished, the candle had burned low, and Corin sat in silence, staring at the journal in her hands as though it held the answer to a question that had haunted him for weeks. "If you are right," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "then no medicine we have given him will ever help. We have been treating the wrong illness entirely." "Then help me," Illyra said. "Help me find whatever is hidden in that study the queen keeps locked. If I am wrong, we have lost nothing but a night's sleep. But if I am right, the king does not have much time left." Corin was quiet for a long moment, the weight of the decision settling heavily over the small room. Outside, somewhere in the depths of the palace, a bell rang softly, marking the passing of another hour the king spent trapped in an illness no ordinary physician could hope to cure. Finally, Corin nodded, slow and resolute. "I know a way into that wing that avoids the main guards," he said. "It will not be easy, and if we are caught, there will be no explaining our way out of it. But you did not walk back into a palace that discarded you without good reason. I believe you. Now let us find out if you are right." The corridor Corin led her through was narrow and cold, meant for servants carrying firewood and washing water rather than nobles in silk gowns. Illyra followed close behind him, her heart pounding with every echo of their footsteps against the stone floor, every distant sound making her freeze and press herself against the wall until she was certain no one approached. "This passage runs behind the private wing," Corin whispered, guiding her past a row of unlit torches. "It was built generations ago, so servants could move without disturbing the royal family. Most people have forgotten it exists." "How did you learn of it?" "An old physician showed me, years ago, when I first arrived as an apprentice. Said every healer should know how to move quietly through this palace, in case a patient needed urgent help and the main halls were too crowded to pass." They moved in silence after that, Illyra's mind racing through everything she had read in her grandmother's journal, trying to recall every detail about how such a binding illness might be reversed, or at least understood, once its source was found. The pages had spoken of objects, small things imbued with intention through ritual, hidden close to the victim so their influence could take root and grow. A lock of hair, a piece of clothing, something personal, something taken without consent. The passage ended at a small wooden door, unlocked but stiff with age, opening into a narrow servant's alcove just off the main hallway of the royal private wing. Corin held up a hand, motioning for silence, and peered carefully around the corner. "2 guards, usual positions," he whispered, "but the study door itself has no guard tonight." "Strange," It has been watched every night since the queen took to locking it. Elira felt a chill at that. Perhaps she believes no one would dare attempt this, or perhaps she is inside herself. They waited, crouched in the shadows of the alcove, watching the guards pace their slow, predictable route along the corridor. It took nearly 20 minutes before both men turned a corner at the same time, briefly leaving the hallway near the study unwatched. Now, Corin breathed, and they moved quickly, silently, across the open corridor toward the heavy wooden door of the king's private study. The door was locked, exactly as the kitchen maids had said, but Corin produced a small ring of thin metal tools from his satchel, the same kind physicians sometimes use to open stubborn medicine cabinets, and worked quickly at the lock with practiced, steady hands. Elira kept watch behind them, every second stretching unbearably long, until finally the lock gave way with a soft click. Inside, the study was dark, lit only by moonlight filtering through a single tall window. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books and scrolls, and a large desk sat near the center of the room, covered in papers that looked untouched for weeks. "We do not have much time," Corin whispered, closing the door softly behind them. "What are we looking for?" Elira moved carefully through the room, running her fingers along the shelves, searching for anything out of place, anything that felt wrong among the ordinary clutter of a scholarly study. Her grandmother's journal had described such objects as often hidden in unremarkable places, disguised among everyday belongings so as not to draw attention. She checked behind the books first, finding nothing but dust and old letters. She examined the desk drawers, filled only with correspondence and unused quills. Frustration began to creep in, along with the fear that perhaps she had been wrong after all, that she had risked everything, dragged Corin into danger alongside her, for nothing more than an old woman's superstition. Then her eyes fell on a small wooden chest tucked beneath the window seat, half hidden by a heavy curtain. It was plain, unremarkable, the kind of chest one might use to store old letters or forgotten trinkets, but something about its placement, deliberately hidden from casual view, made her pause. "Corin," she whispered, kneeling beside it, "help me with this." The chest was locked, smaller than the study door but no less stubborn, and Corin worked at it with the same careful tools, his hands steady despite the tension clearly written across his face. After a moment, the lock clicked open, and Elira lifted the lid slowly, half expecting nothing, half dreading exactly what she might find. Inside lay a small bundle wrapped in dark cloth, tied with a cord of braided black thread. Elira lifted it carefully, feeling an odd, unpleasant weight to it despite its small size, and unwrapped the cloth with trembling fingers. Within lay a lock of pale hair, tied with the same black thread, resting atop a small folded piece of parchment, covered in symbols Elira did not recognize. Strange marks that seemed to shift uncomfortably in the moonlight, as though unwilling to be looked at directly. "What is that?" Corin whispered, leaning closer, his face pale. "I believe," Elira said slowly, her voice barely steady, "that this is what has been making the king ill." She turned the bundle over carefully, careful not to touch the strange parchment directly, and noticed something tucked beneath it, a small folded note in handwriting she recognized instantly, elegant and precise, the same handwriting that had signed the marriage documents joining Lady Muriel to the king only months before. Her stomach turned cold as she read the brief words written there, a simple reminder, seemingly meant only for the writer's own memory, listing dates and small instructions that made no sense on their own, but painted a clear and horrifying picture when considered alongside everything else. "This was placed here deliberately," Elira said quietly, "by someone with access to the king's private study. Someone trusted enough to come and go without suspicion." Corin's face had gone entirely pale in the moonlight. "You believe the queen herself did this?" "I believe," Elira said carefully, wrapping the bundle back in its cloth with hands that shook despite her effort to stay calm, "that we need proof strong enough to convince a court that has already decided I am nothing more than a bitter, discarded wife seeking revenge. This alone will not be enough. They will say I planted it myself. Then what do we do?" Elira thought for a long moment, the weight of the small bundle heavy in her hands, heavier than its size should have allowed. Outside, in the corridor, she heard the faint sound of footsteps returning, the guards completing their rounds, drawing steadily closer to the study door. "We need to understand exactly what this is," she whispered urgently, "and how it can be undone. My grandmother's journal spoke of such bindings, but not in enough detail to act safely. There may be someone in this city who knows more, someone who has studied these old practices beyond what my grandmother recorded. And if there is no such person—" Elira met his eyes in the dim moonlight, her decision already forming despite the danger it carried. "Then we will have to learn quickly, and hope we are not too late." The footsteps outside grew louder, and Corin's eyes widened with alarm. "We need to leave, now, before we are found in here, with no explanation that will not end in both our arrests." They moved quickly, replacing the chest exactly as they had found it, tucking the strange bundle carefully into Elira's satchel beneath her grandmother's journal, and slipping back through the study door, just as the guard's footsteps rounded the final corner toward the hallway. Corin pulled the door shut behind them, and they retreated into the shadowed alcove, just as the two guards resumed their post outside the study, entirely unaware of what had transpired only moments before. They did not speak again until they had made their way back through the narrow servants' passage, back into the relative safety of Corin's small quarters, where Elira finally allowed herself to breathe fully for the first time since entering the palace. "We found something," Corin said quietly, sitting heavily in his chair, "but I fear we have only uncovered a deeper problem. If the Queen truly did this, exposing her will not be simple. She has the king's ear, the court's favor, and every advantage a disgraced woman like yourself does not." Elira placed the wrapped bundle carefully on the desk between them, staring at it as though it might reveal further secrets simply by being looked at long enough. "Then we will need more than suspicion," she said. "We need someone who understands these old practices well enough to prove exactly what this object is, and how to reverse whatever it has done to the king before it takes his life entirely." Corin rubbed his tired eyes, glancing toward the small window where the first pale hints of dawn had begun to touch the sky. "There is an old woman in the lower city," he said slowly. "A healer some call a witch, though I have always thought that word unkind and inaccurate. The physicians dismiss her as a fraud, but I have heard whispers that she has helped villagers with illnesses no ordinary medicine could touch. If anyone in this city understands bindings such as this, it would be her." "Then that is where we go next," Elira said, wrapping the bundle carefully and tucking it deep into her satchel once more. "Before the sun rises fully, and this palace wakes to another day of watching its king grow weaker, while the true cause of his suffering sits locked away, hidden by the very woman who claims to love him." The lower city looked nothing like the palace grounds Elira had grown used to during her years as the king's wife. Narrow streets twisted between leaning buildings, laundry lines stretched overhead between windows, and the smell of wood smoke and frying fish hung thick in the early morning air. Corin led the way with quiet confidence, clearly no stranger to these streets despite his position within the palace walls. "You come here often?" Elira asked, pulling her hood lower as a group of early risers passed them on the narrow road. "More than the other physicians would approve of," Corin admitted. "The court teaches us that only certain kinds of knowledge count as real medicine. I have never quite believed that. Illness does not care about titles or training. Sometimes the old healers understand things the university-taught physicians have forgotten entirely." They stopped eventually before a small house at the end of a quiet lane, its shutters painted a faded green, a single candle burning in the window despite the growing daylight. Corin knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more, a pattern that seemed deliberate, practiced. The door opened to reveal an elderly woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in a simple braid. She looked between Corin and Elira with obvious suspicion before her gaze settled on the satchel Elira carried, and something in her expression shifted. "You carry something you should not be carrying," the woman said, her voice low and steady. "Best come inside before someone sees." The interior of the house was cramped but orderly, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, bundles of dried flowers hanging from the low ceiling, and a small fire crackling in the hearth despite the early hour. The old woman gestured for them to sit at a worn wooden table and settled across from them, studying Elira with an intensity that made her feel as though every secret she carried was already known. "My name is Halda," the woman said. "I understand you have found something troubling." "How did you know?" Alira asked, startled. Halda's mouth twitched into something close to a smile. The way you hold that bag, as though it might bite you if you loosen your grip. Show me. Alira hesitated only a moment, before pulling the wrapped bundle from her satchel and placing it carefully on the table. Halda's expression darkened the instant she saw it, even before Alira had fully unwrapped the cloth. A binding, Halda said quietly, leaning forward to examine the lock of hair and the strange symbols on the parchment without touching either directly. And not a clumsy one. Whoever made this understood the old ways well, better than most who dabble in such things today. Can you tell us what it does? Corin asked. Exactly what it is doing to whoever it targets? Halda studied the parchment for a long moment before answering, her sharp eyes tracing the strange symbols with obvious familiarity. This is a wasting binding. It draws strength from its target slowly, over weeks or months, weakening the body and troubling the mind, all while leaving no visible wound, no clear cause a physician could ever hope to diagnose. It is cruel work, patient work. Whoever created this did not want a quick end. They wanted suffering and time enough to watch it happen. Alira felt a chill run through her at those words, thinking of the king's trembling hands, his nightmares, the marks that appeared and vanished on his skin. Can it be reversed? Sometimes, Halda said carefully. It depends on how deeply the binding has taken hold, and how much time remains before the damage becomes permanent. The lock of hair tells me the binding was made using something taken directly from the victim, which makes it stronger, harder to break, but also gives us a path to undo it, if we act with care, and if we are not too late. What do we need to do? Alira asked, leaning forward. Halda was quiet for a long moment, studying the bundle with a thoughtful frown before finally speaking. The binding must be unmade using the same elements that created it, reversed in careful order, under specific conditions. It requires certain herbs I do not currently have in sufficient quantity, and it requires proximity to the victim during the unmaking. This cannot be done from a distance, and it cannot be done in secret. Not fully. Whoever is bound to this illness must be present, awake and willing, for the reversal to take proper hold. The king does not know I am here, Alira said slowly. He does not know any of this exists. Getting him to willingly participate in something like this, especially coming from me, after everything that happened between us. Then you will need to convince him, Halda said simply. Or convince someone close enough to him to make the arrangements without alerting whoever placed this binding in the first place. Tell me, do you know who created this? Alira exchanged a glance with Corin before answering carefully. We have strong suspicion, though not yet certain proof. Halda's expression grew grave. Then move carefully, and quickly. Whoever created this binding will not simply allow it to be undone once they realize it has been discovered. If they sense discovery, they may act to finish what the binding has slowly begun, through more direct and immediate means. The weight of those words settled heavily over the small room. Alira thought of Lady Muriel, now queen, with her calm smile and her locked study, her careful control over who was permitted near the king during his illness. If the queen realized her binding had been found, what might she do to protect herself, and to ensure her husband's illness reached its intended conclusion, before the truth could be exposed? We need those herbs, Alira said, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the fear building in her chest. And we need a way to reach the king without the queen's knowledge, to explain what has happened, and gain his trust long enough to attempt this reversal. Halda rose from the table, moving toward her shelves of jars, and beginning to gather small bundles of dried plants, wrapping each carefully in cloth as she spoke. I can prepare what is needed by tomorrow evening, but you must understand, this reversal will not be without risk to the king himself. Undoing a binding this deeply rooted can be as dangerous as the binding itself, if not done with proper care. There is no guarantee of success, only a chance, better than the alternative of allowing the illness to continue unchecked. A chance is more than he has now, Alira said quietly. Halda nodded slowly, continuing her preparations. Then let us not waste the little time we have. Tell me everything you know about how this binding might have been placed, when it began, and who has had access to the king during these past weeks. Every detail may matter. For the next hour, Illyra and Corin recounted everything they knew, piecing together the timeline of the king's illness, alongside the timeline of Lady Muriel's arrival at court, the locked study, the dismissed physicians, the careful control the new queen maintained over every aspect of her husband's care. Hulda listened intently, occasionally asking sharp, pointed questions that revealed a mind far more analytical than her humble cottage suggested. By the time they finished, the sun had risen fully, and the sounds of the lower city waking to another day drifted through the small window. Hulda handed Illyra a carefully wrapped bundle of herbs, along with detailed instructions written in a careful hand on a small scrap of parchment. "Follow these instructions exactly," Hulda said firmly. "The timing matters as much as the ingredients. And remember, you will need the king present and willing. Without his cooperation, none of this will work." "How do I convince him to trust me?" Illyra asked quietly. "After everything that happened between us, after he humiliated me before the entire court, and cast me aside without a second thought?" Hulda's expression softened slightly, the first gentleness she had shown since they arrived. "You do not need him to trust you fully, child. You only need him desperate enough to listen, and weak enough to have run out of other options."
From what you have described of his condition, I suspect he is very close to exactly that point. Illyra tucked the bundle of herbs carefully into her satchel, alongside the wrapped binding object and her grandmother's journal, feeling the weight of the task ahead settle heavily on her shoulders.
She had come to the capital, seeking only understanding, only truth. Now she found herself carrying the responsibility of a king's life, a responsibility she had never asked for, and was not certain she was prepared to bear. "Thank you," she said to Hulda, rising from the table, "for your help and your honesty." "Do not thank me yet," Hulda said, walking them to the door. "Thank me if this works, and if you both survive long enough to see it through. Whoever placed that binding will not simply stand aside and watch their careful work undone. Be careful, and be swift. Time is not on your side." Illyra and Corin stepped back out into the busy morning streets of the lower city, the weight of their task now clearer and heavier than ever before. Behind them, Hulda watched from her doorway a moment longer, her sharp eyes following them until they disappeared around the corner, before she finally closed her door and returned to her small, quiet house, already praying, in her own way, that the two young people carried enough courage for what lay ahead. Getting close to the king proved far more difficult than either Illyra or Corin had anticipated. The private wing of the palace remained heavily guarded during daylight hours, and Corin's role as a physician's apprentice granted him only limited access, always under the watchful supervision of senior physicians who reported directly to the queen. "I cannot simply walk you into the king's chambers," Corin said as they sat in a quiet corner of the palace gardens, disguised among the gardeners tending the winter beds. "Every visit is logged, every visitor recorded. If your name appears anywhere near his chambers, questions will be asked before we ever reach him." "Then we need another approach," Illyra said, watching a pair of guards patrol the garden path in the distance. "Someone who can reach him directly, someone whose presence would not raise suspicion." Corin thought for a long moment, absently pulling weeds from the flower bed beside him to maintain their disguise as they spoke. "There is old Bennett, the king's personal attendant. He has served the royal family for over 30 years, long before the current queen arrived. I believe he still holds genuine affection for the king, beyond mere duty. He might be willing to help, if approached carefully." "Do you trust him?" "I do not know him well enough to say for certain," Corin admitted, "but he is one of the few people still permitted regular, unsupervised access to the king's private chambers. If anyone could arrange a quiet meeting, it would be him." They spent the remainder of the day observing the palace routines from a careful distance, learning old Bennett's schedule, the hours he spent tending to the king's personal needs, away from the watchful eyes of the queen's chosen physicians. It was late in the evening, as the palace settled into its nighttime quiet, that Corin finally approached the elderly attendant alone, leaving Illyra waiting nervously in the shadows of a nearby corridor. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, though it felt far longer to Illyra, straining to catch fragments of hushed words she could not quite make out. Finally, Corin returned, his expression a careful mixture of relief and worry. "He will help," Corin said quietly, But he was cautious, and rightfully so. He has noticed things himself these past weeks, things that troubled him deeply, but that he had no explanation for. The Queen's strict control over the King's care, her insistence on privacy during certain hours, her reaction whenever anyone suggests bringing in physicians from outside the palace. He said it felt wrong, though he could not have named why until I explained what we suspect. When can we see the King? Tomorrow night, Corin said. The Queen attends a gathering with visiting nobles from the northern provinces, a diplomatic obligation she cannot avoid without raising suspicion herself. Bennett says the King will be alone in his chambers during that time, save for the usual guards outside his door. It is our best chance, and likely our only one for several days. The following day passed with agonizing slowness. Alira spent the hours reviewing Halda's instructions again and again, memorizing every step of the reversal process, every measurement of herbs, every careful word of the ritual that needed to be spoken precisely to unmake the binding that had been placed upon the King. Corin, meanwhile, gathered what additional supplies he could from the physician's stores without drawing attention, careful never to take more than could be easily explained if questioned. As evening approached, Alira changed once more into plain servant's clothing, tucking her hair beneath a simple cap, while Corin prepared a small basket of what appeared to be ordinary medicinal supplies, the herbs and binding object carefully concealed beneath layers of bandages and tonics that would survive casual inspection. They made their way through the palace as the Queen's departure for the evening gathering was announced, a flurry of activity as attendants prepared her carriage and nobles gathered in the main courtyard to bid farewell to their hostess. Using the distraction to their advantage, Alira and Corin slipped through the servant passages once more, finding old Bennett waiting exactly where he had promised, near a small side door leading into the King's private chambers. "Quickly," Bennett whispered, his weathered face tense with worry. "The guards outside believe you are physicians bringing evening treatments. Do not linger longer than necessary, and if anyone questions you, let me speak." They followed him through a narrow hallway, into a dimly lit antechamber, and finally into the King's bedchamber itself. Alira's breath caught at the sight that greeted her. King Alden lay propped against a mountain of pillows, his once commanding presence reduced to something frail and diminished. His hands trembled visibly even at rest, dark circles ringed his eyes, and his skin held an unhealthy pallor that spoke of weeks of suffering. He looked nothing like the man who had stood before the entire court and cast her aside with such cold certainty. His eyes opened slowly as they entered, confusion flickering across his weakened features. "Bennett, who are these people? I did not request additional physicians." "Your Majesty," Bennett said gently, moving to the King's bedside, "please, hear them out. I believe they may be able to help you, in ways the court physicians have not." The King's gaze shifted toward Alira, and recognition slowly dawned in his tired eyes, followed swiftly by shock. "Alira? What is the meaning of this? You should not be here." "I know I am the last person you expected to see," Alira said carefully, stepping closer despite the guard's training that told her to remain distant from a king who had cast her out so publicly. "And I know you have no reason to trust me, given how our last meeting ended. But I believe your illness is not natural, and I believe I know its cause." The King's expression twisted between confusion and suspicion. "You come to me now, after weeks of silence, claiming knowledge no physician in this kingdom has managed to find. Forgive me, if I find that difficult to believe." "Then let me show you," Alira said, and with Corin's help, she carefully unwrapped the bundle they had found hidden in his private study, laying it gently on a small table beside his bed. "This was hidden in your own study, Your Majesty. A binding, created to slowly weaken your body and torment your mind." The King stared at the lock of hair and the strange symbols, his weakened features tightening with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. "This is madness. Who would do such a thing? And how would you have found something hidden in my own private study?" Alira hesitated only a moment before answering honestly. "I do not say this lightly, Your Majesty, and I understand the weight of such an accusation. But everything I have learned suggests this was placed there by someone with intimate access to your private chambers. Someone who benefits greatly from your continued suffering, and who has worked carefully to keep you isolated from anyone who might discover the truth." The king's eyes widened slowly as understanding began to take shape, his gaze drifting toward the locked door of his private study, visible through the open archway connecting their rooms. "Muriel," he whispered, the name carrying a weight of disbelief and dawning betrayal. "You believe my own wife has done this to me?" "I cannot say with absolute certainty," Elira said carefully, "but the evidence points strongly in that direction." A note in her handwriting was found alongside the binding itself, and her insistence on controlling your care, keeping physicians at a distance, maintaining strict privacy over her own comings and goings, all align with what a person hiding such a secret might do. The king closed his eyes, his trembling hands clenching weakly against the bedsheets, the weight of betrayal settling visibly over his exhausted features. When he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the commanding authority Elira remembered from their marriage. "I married her, believing her affection was genuine," he said softly. "I was a fool, blinded by grief after our own marriage ended so poorly, eager for comfort wherever I could find it. If what you say is true, I have brought this suffering upon myself through my own foolishness." "You are not to blame for another person's cruelty," Elira said gently, surprising herself with the genuine sympathy in her voice despite everything that had passed between them. "But we do not have much time. If this binding continues unchecked, the healer I consulted believes your condition will only worsen, potentially beyond recovery. We have the means to reverse it, but it requires your willing participation, and it must happen tonight, while the queen remains away from the palace." The king studied her for a long, searching moment, weighing years of complicated history, public humiliation, and now this unexpected act of mercy from a woman he had wronged so publicly. Finally, he nodded, slow and resolute despite his obvious exhaustion. "Then let us begin," he said quietly. "Whatever must be done, I am willing to try. I would rather face uncertain recovery than continue wasting away in ignorance while my own wife watches and smiles." Elira exchanged a glance with Corin, both of them understanding the gravity of what lay ahead. She reached into her satchel and withdrew Halda's carefully prepared herbs and instructions, her hands steady despite the fear building quietly beneath her calm exterior. "Bennett," she said, turning to the elderly attendant, "we will need your help to ensure we are not disturbed. This process cannot be interrupted once it begins." Bennett nodded firmly, moving toward the chamber door to keep watch. "I will ensure no one enters, Lady Elira, whatever it takes." As Elira began laying out the herbs according to Halda's precise instructions, she allowed herself a brief moment to consider the strange path that had brought her here, from a humiliated, discarded wife standing before a mocking court, to the one person now standing between a suffering king and whatever fate his betraying queen had intended for him. Whatever happened next, she understood there was no turning back from this moment. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as Elira arranged the herbs Halda had provided, each bundle placed with careful precision, according to the instructions written on the small scrap of parchment. Corin stood nearby, holding a single candle steady, its flame the only source of light, besides the dim glow of the dying hearth fire. "You must remain still, Your Majesty," Elira said gently, kneeling beside the bed where the king lay watching her with a mixture of exhaustion and cautious hope. "And you must focus your thoughts, as much as your strength allows, on releasing whatever hold this binding has taken over you." Halda said, "The mind's participation matters as much as the herbs themselves." The king nodded weakly, closing his eyes as instructed. Elira began the process exactly as Halda had described, first burning a small pinch of dried herbs in a shallow dish, filling the room with a sharp, earthy scent that made her eyes water slightly. She then unwrapped the binding object itself, the lock of hair and strange parchment, and placed it carefully within a circle of white ash she traced around the dish. "Bennett," she called softly, "is the hallway still clear?" Quiet as a tomb, Bennett whispered back from his post at the door, his voice tight with tension. Elira began speaking the words Halda had taught her, an old chant meant to call back what had been taken and unravel the intention woven into the binding. Her voice wavered at first, unfamiliar with the strange rhythm of the ancient words, but she steadied herself and continued, watching carefully as the herbs burned lower and the flame in the shallow dish flickered strangely, bending in directions that no draft in the room could explain. The king's breathing grew labored partway through the ritual, his body trembling more violently than before, and for a terrifying moment, Illyra feared they had made a grave mistake, that the reversal was harming him rather than healing him. Corin moved instinctively toward the bed, but Illyra raised a hand to stop him. "Wait," she said firmly, though her own heart pounded with uncertainty. Halda warned this might happen. The binding will resist before it breaks. We must continue. She pressed forward with the remaining words of the chant, her voice growing steadier with each passing moment, despite the fear gripping her chest. The flame in the dish suddenly flared bright, casting strange shadows across the chamber walls, before extinguishing entirely, plunging the room into a deeper darkness broken only by Corin's single candle. The king gasped, his back arching slightly off the bed, before he collapsed back against his pillows, breathing hard, but suddenly, remarkably calmer than he had been in weeks. The violent trembling in his hands slowly began to ease, and color returned, faint but present, to his previously pale cheeks. "Your Majesty?" Illyra asked urgently, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" The king's eyes fluttered open, disoriented, but clearer than Illyra had seen them since she arrived. "I feel—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Lighter. As though something heavy has been lifted from my chest that I did not fully realize was there." Relief flooded through Illyra so intensely that she nearly wept, though she forced herself to remain composed, aware that their task was not yet fully complete. She gathered the burned remains of the binding object carefully, wrapping them in a fresh cloth to be disposed of properly, exactly as Halda had instructed, far from the palace grounds where its influence could never again take hold. "It is done," she said quietly, though the weight in her voice suggested she understood this was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning still to come. Corin checked the king's pulse and breathing with practiced hands, his expression shifting from cautious worry to genuine, relieved amazement. "His pulse is steadier than it has been in weeks, Your Majesty. Whatever afflicted you, I believe Lady Illyra has truly broken its hold." The king struggled to sit up slightly, his movement still weak but noticeably less strained than before. "Then I owe you a debt I am not certain I can ever properly repay," he said, looking at Illyra with an expression that held none of the cold dismissal she remembered from the day of her banishment. "You came to a palace that cast you out with cruelty, risking your own safety, to save a man who showed you nothing but public humiliation. I do not understand why you would do such a thing." Illyra considered the question carefully before answering, surprised by her own honesty. "I did not do this entirely for you, Your Majesty. I did it because I could not stand by, while an innocent illness was allowed to consume a kingdom's leader, when I held the knowledge to prevent it. And I did it because I needed to understand the truth for myself, about what happened to me, and about who truly orchestrated my fall from this court." The king's expression darkened slightly at the reminder of Lady Muriel's likely involvement, both in his illness and, Illyra suspected, in the sudden urgency of her own banishment months before. "If she is responsible for this," he said, his voice gaining a firmer edge despite his continued weakness, "then she has committed a crime against the crown itself, not merely a private betrayal. This cannot go unanswered." "We do not yet have proof strong enough to bring before the full court," Illyra cautioned. "The binding object is destroyed now, as it needed to be for the reversal to hold properly. All that remains is the note in her handwriting, which alone may not be enough to convince nobles who already view me with suspicion and scorn." The king was quiet for a long moment, clearly turning the problem over in his mind, despite his continued exhaustion. "Then we will need to be clever about how we proceed," he said finally. "If Muriel realizes her plan has failed, she may act more directly, more dangerously, to protect herself. We must gather what proof we can while appearing, for now, as though nothing has changed." "That will not be easy," Corin said quietly. "The Queen is perceptive. She may notice improvements in your condition and grow suspicious immediately." "Then I will conceal my recovery as best I can," the king said, a flicker of his old resolve returning to his weakened features. "I have spent years learning to mask my true thoughts before a court full of watching eyes. I can manage a few more days of deception, if it means gathering the proof needed to expose the truth properly." Illyra nodded slowly, though worry still gnawed at her. "We will need to move carefully from here. Corin and I will continue investigating quietly, searching for anything further that might strengthen our case. Bennett, can we trust you to keep watch over the king and alert us immediately if anything changes? You have my word, Bennett said firmly from his post at the door. I have served this king for 30 years. I will not allow harm to come to him now, not when the truth finally stands within reach. As the first hints of the queen's expected return began to stir through the palace, distant sounds of carriages and attendants preparing for her arrival, Alira and Corin gathered their remaining supplies and prepared to slip back through the servant passages before anyone noticed their presence in the king's private chambers. Before they left, the king caught Alira's wrist gently, his grip weak but earnest. Alira, he said quietly, whatever happens from here, whatever the court decides once this truth comes to light, know that I see clearly now how wrongly I treated you. You did not deserve the humiliation I brought upon you before the entire court. I am ashamed of the man I was that day. Alira met his gaze steadily, feeling a complicated mixture of old resentment and unexpected sympathy settle within her chest. We can speak of the past once your future is secured, Your Majesty. For now, rest, and let us finish what we have started. She slipped out of the chamber alongside Corin, disappearing once more into the palace's hidden passages, just as the sounds of the queen's returning carriage echoed faintly through the distant courtyard, entirely unaware of how close her carefully laid plans had come to unraveling that very night. 3 days passed in a tense, careful rhythm. Alira remained hidden within the city, staying at a small inn Corin arranged for her under a false name, while Corin himself continued his duties at the palace, watching for any sign that the queen suspected the truth had been discovered. The king, true to his word, played the role of a slowly recovering patient with remarkable skill, careful never to reveal the full extent of his returning strength during the physician's visits that Lady Muriel still insisted on overseeing personally. It was on the 4th day that Corin arrived at the inn with troubling news, his expression tight with worry, as he settled across from Alira at a small corner table. The queen has grown suspicious, he said quietly, keeping his voice low, despite the near-empty common room. She questioned the physicians extensively this morning about the king's apparent improvement, and I overheard her speaking privately with one of her personal attendants about needing to, in her words, ensure matters proceed as planned. Alira felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She means to act again. I fear so, Corin said, and this time, she may not rely on something as slow as a binding illness. If she believes her plan has been discovered, she may choose a more direct and immediate method to secure whatever outcome she originally intended. We need to move quickly then, Alira said, her mind racing through their limited options. We have the note in her handwriting, but as we discussed, that alone may not be enough proof for a court inclined to doubt my word from the start. We need something more, something undeniable. Corin hesitated before speaking again, clearly weighing whether to share what he had learned. There may be a way, he said slowly. I spoke with one of the kitchen maids again, the same one who first mentioned the queen's strange behavior. She said Lady Muriel has been receiving visitors late at night, a man who arrives through the servants' gate under cover of darkness, always leaving before dawn. No one seems to know his identity, but the maid described him as wearing robes similar to those worn by scholars of the old practices, the same kind of knowledge your grandmother's journal describes. Someone helped her create the binding, Alira said, understanding dawning quickly. If we can identify this man and connect him directly to Lady Muriel's scheme, it would provide far stronger evidence than a single note alone. That is my thought as well, Corin agreed. But finding him will not be simple. We do not know when he next plans to visit, or how to identify him without drawing the queen's attention to our own suspicions. Alira considered the problem carefully, turning over what she knew of palace routines and the patterns of servants moving through the city at night. The kitchen maid who told you this, does she work regular hours near the servants' gate? She does, most evenings. Then perhaps she would be willing to alert us the next time this visitor appears, Alira suggested. If we can be present, waiting nearby, we might follow him and learn his identity, or better yet, overhear enough of his conversation with the queen to gather proof of their conspiracy. Corin nodded slowly, though concern remained evident on his face. It is risky. If we are discovered watching the queen's private meetings, there will be no explaining our presence away, as easily as sneaking into a locked study for a few brief minutes. "I understand the risk," Illyra said firmly, "but we have little choice remaining. If Lady Muriel intends to act more directly against the king, we cannot afford to wait for a safer opportunity that may never come." That evening, Corin returned to the palace to speak quietly with the kitchen maid, arranging for her to send word the moment the mysterious visitor next appeared at the servants' gate. 2 more tense days passed with no word, days during which Illyra remained cautious, moving between different lodgings within the city to avoid drawing attention, while Corin continued monitoring the king's condition and the queen's increasingly agitated behavior within the palace walls. Finally, on the evening of the 6th day since the reversal ritual, a young kitchen boy arrived breathlessly at Illyra's lodging, sent by the maid with an urgent message. The mysterious visitor had been spotted approaching the servants' gate only a short while earlier. Illyra wasted no time, quickly gathering her cloak and rushing through the darkened streets toward the palace, meeting Corin at a prearranged spot near the servants' entrance. Together, they made their way through the shadows, following at a careful distance as a robed figure moved silently through the narrow servant passages toward the private wing of the palace. "That is definitely not a palace servant's usual attire," Corin whispered, studying the man's dark robes, embroidered with faint symbols that seemed to catch and hold the dim moonlight in unsettling ways. They followed carefully, staying well back to avoid detection, watching as the robed figure moved with obvious familiarity through passages that should have been unknown to any ordinary visitor. He clearly had been here many times before. The man eventually reached a small side door, leading into what Illyra recognized as an antechamber connected to the queen's private quarters, distinct from the king's chambers, where the earlier ritual had taken place. He knocked softly in a specific pattern, and the door opened almost immediately, revealing Lady Muriel herself, dressed not in her usual elaborate court attire, but in simple dark clothing, her expression tense and businesslike. Illyra and Corin pressed themselves into a shadowed alcove nearby, close enough to catch fragments of the conversation drifting through the partially opened door. "Noticed improvement," Lady Muriel's voice carried faintly, sharp with frustration. "The physicians say his tremors have lessened considerably these past days. How is this possible if the binding remains intact?" The robed man's response was quieter, harder to make out, though Illyra caught the words "someone" and "interfered" clearly enough to understand the implication. "Then we find out who," Lady Muriel snapped, her voice rising slightly before she visibly caught herself, lowering it again to a harsh whisper. "I did not orchestrate his humiliating dismissal of that pathetic former wife and endure months of pretending affection toward a man I despise, only to have my plans unravel now, so close to completion." Illyra's breath caught sharply in her chest at those words, confirming what she had begun to suspect but had not yet heard stated so plainly. Lady Muriel had orchestrated not only the binding illness, but Illyra's own banishment months before, manipulating the king's judgment to clear her own path to the throne. "We need a stronger method," Lady Muriel continued, her voice tight with barely restrained anger, "something that cannot be reversed so easily, should someone truly be interfering with our work. Can you prepare something more immediate?" The robed man's reply was too quiet to catch fully, but Illyra heard enough scattered words, poison, and undetectable among them, to understand the grave direction of their conversation. Corin's hand found Illyra's arm, gripping tightly, his expression a mixture of horror and urgency. They had heard enough, more than enough, to understand the true danger the king now faced, danger far more immediate and difficult to reverse than the slow binding they had already undone. They retreated carefully back through the shadows, moving as quickly and silently as possible away from the queen's private quarters, both understanding, without needing to speak, that everything had now changed. The threat to the king's life was no longer a slow, patient illness that could be quietly undone through careful ritual and old knowledge. It had become something far more immediate and far more dangerous. "We need to warn him," Illyra whispered urgently once they were safely distant from the queen's chambers. "Tonight, if possible. If she intends to use poison, we cannot know when she plans to act, or how quickly it might take effect once administered." "Bennett," Corin said immediately, He can ensure the king eats and drinks nothing prepared without his direct oversight, at least until we can bring this matter properly before the court. And we finally have what we need, Alira added, a grim determination settling over her despite the fear still coursing through her veins. We have heard her confession with our own ears. Now we must find a way to bring this truth before the full court, in a manner that cannot be dismissed or denied, before she has the chance to silence the king permanently. They moved quickly back through the servant passages, the weight of what they had overheard pressing urgently against them, both keenly aware that the time remaining to expose Lady Muriel's true nature had suddenly, dramatically shortened. They reached Bennet's small quarters near the king's chambers just before midnight, finding the elderly attendant still awake, sitting by a low fire with obvious worry etched across his weathered face. He rose quickly upon seeing their urgent expressions. "What has happened?" he asked immediately. Alira quickly recounted everything they had overheard, watching Bennet's expression shift from concern to genuine alarm as the full scope of Lady Muriel's plans became clear. "Poison," Bennet repeated grimly. "I feared something of this nature might come, once she realized her original plan had failed. I will ensure nothing reaches the king's table without passing through my own hands first, starting tonight. But this cannot continue indefinitely. We need to bring this before the court, and soon, before she finds another way around our precautions." "We heard her confession clearly enough," Corin said. "But it was only the two of us present. Without additional witnesses or stronger proof, presenting this before the full court risks becoming simply our word against hers, and the court has already shown little inclination to believe Alira over a woman they crowned as their new queen." Alira paced the small room, turning the problem over in her mind with growing urgency. "We need someone else to hear her confess, someone whose word would not be so easily dismissed. Or we need physical evidence linking her directly to this poison scheme, something undeniable that even a skeptical court cannot ignore." "The robed man," Bennet said thoughtfully. "If he prepares poison for her, he likely does so somewhere within the city, perhaps in the same manner as the binding materials were gathered. If we could identify him, learn where he conducts his work, we might find evidence there." "That could take days we may not have," Corin said, worry evident in his voice. "And every day that passes is another day the queen has opportunity to act against the king directly." Alira stopped pacing, an idea slowly forming, despite the fear still gripping her chest. "What if we do not wait for her to act? What if we create an opportunity to catch her in the act itself, before witnesses who cannot be dismissed?" Both men looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "What do you mean?" Bennet asked. "The king could announce a small gathering," Alira explained, the plan taking clearer shape as she spoke. "A modest dinner, perhaps, celebrating his apparent recovery, inviting a handful of trusted nobles along with the queen herself. If we can arrange for Bennet to closely monitor whatever dish or drink the queen attempts to introduce to the king during this gathering, with witnesses present to observe the moment she is caught attempting to poison him, there could be no denying the truth before the entire court." "It is a dangerous plan," Bennet said slowly, considering the risks. "If she suspects even slightly that she is being watched, she may simply refrain from acting, and we will have gained nothing while revealing our suspicions to her directly." "Then we must ensure she does not suspect," Alira said firmly. "The king must appear entirely unaware, continuing to show only gradual, believable improvement, giving her no reason to think her plans have been discovered. We allow her the opportunity she believes she needs, while quietly ensuring witnesses are positioned to observe and intervene at the critical moment." Corin nodded slowly, though his expression remained tense. "It could work, if executed with enough care, but we will need trustworthy witnesses, nobles whose testimony the court cannot easily dismiss. Do you know of anyone who might stand with us in this?" Alira thought carefully, running through the faces of nobles she had known during her years at court, searching for anyone whose loyalty had not shifted entirely toward flattering the new queen. "Lord Halvard," she said finally. "He served as an advisor to the king's own father, and has always valued honesty over court politics. He was one of the few who did not join in the mockery the day of my banishment. I believe he might be willing to listen, if approached carefully with proof, rather than mere accusation." "Speaking with him carries its own risk," Bennet cautioned. "If he does not believe you, or worse, If he reports your suspicions directly to the Queen before we are ready to act, everything could unravel before we even begin. I understand the risk, Illyra said, but we need someone within the court's own ranks, willing to vouch for what we have discovered. Without that, even catching her in the act may not be enough to overcome the doubt and suspicion the court already holds toward me. They spent the remainder of the night refining their plan, discussing timing, arrangements, and the careful balance needed to lure Lady Muriel into revealing her true intentions without alerting her to the trap being carefully constructed around her. By the time dawn began to break over the palace, they had settled on a course of action, dangerous, but necessary given the urgency of their situation. The following morning, the king, following their careful plan, announced to his physicians and attendants that he wished to host a small dinner within the week, celebrating his gradual recovery and expressing gratitude to those who had supported him through his illness, including, pointedly, his devoted wife. Word of the announcement spread quickly through the palace, and Illyra, watching carefully from a distance through Corin's reports, learned that Lady Muriel had received the news with visible, if carefully masked, tension. She agreed to the dinner readily enough, Corin reported later that day, meeting Illyra at a quiet corner of the palace gardens, where they could speak without being overheard, though I noticed her speaking privately with her attendant again shortly after, in the same hushed, urgent tone she used when speaking with the robed visitor. She means to use the opportunity, Illyra said grimly, just as we hoped. Meanwhile, Illyra made careful arrangements to approach Lord Halvard, choosing a moment when he walked alone through the palace gardens, away from other nobles who might overhear or report her presence to the Queen. The elderly lord's expression shifted from surprise to careful, thoughtful attention, as Illyra, disguised once more in plain servant's clothing, quietly explained everything she and Corin had discovered. "This is a grave accusation," Lord Halvard said finally, after listening to her account in full silence. "Against the crowned queen herself. If you are wrong, Illyra, the consequences for you will be severe beyond anything you have already suffered." "I understand the risk," Illyra said steadily, "but I would not have risked returning to this palace, disguising myself, endangering both myself and those who have helped me, if I were not certain of what I have witnessed and overheard. The king's life depends on this truth being exposed before it is too late." Lord Halvard studied her for a long, searching moment, weighing decades of court experience against the earnest conviction evident in her voice. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I will attend this dinner," he said, "and I will watch carefully, as you ask. If what you say proves true, I will stand as witness before the full court, regardless of the consequences to my own standing. The kingdom deserves better than a queen who would poison her own husband for whatever ambition drives her." Relief flooded through Illyra at his words, though the weight of what remained ahead settled heavily upon her regardless. The dinner was arranged for 3 days hence, giving them little time to finalize every remaining detail of their careful plan. Every hour that passed brought them closer to the moment when Lady Muriel's true nature would finally be exposed before witnesses who could not be dismissed, or when their entire careful scheme might unravel catastrophically, leaving the king more vulnerable than ever before. The evening of the dinner arrived with a tension that seemed to hang thick in the air of the palace, though only a handful of people understood its true source. The great dining hall had been prepared with modest elegance befitting a celebration of the king's recovery. Long tables set with fine dishes, candles casting warm light across gathered nobles who spoke in polite, curious tones about the king's remarkable improvement after weeks of frightening illness. Illyra remained hidden, disguised as a serving attendant, positioned carefully near the kitchen entrance, where she could observe the proceedings without drawing attention to herself. Corin worked alongside the palace's regular physicians, ostensibly present only to monitor the king's continued recovery, while Bennett stood at his usual post near the king's chair, watching every dish and drink that passed before his master with unwavering vigilance. Lord Halvard sat among the assembled nobles, his expression carefully neutral despite the weight of what he had agreed to watch for. The king entered the hall to warm applause, playing his role with convincing skill, moving with slightly labored steps that suggested continued weakness, even as his eyes carried a sharpness that belied his true recovering strength. Lady Muriel walked beside him, resplendent in deep green silk, her smile gracious and warm as she greeted the assembled nobles, the very picture of a devoted, relieved wife. Illyra watched her carefully from the shadows near the kitchen, searching for any sign of the tension that had been evident during her private conversation with the robed visitor days before. Lady Muriel's composure remained flawless, betraying nothing of whatever plan she carried forward this evening. The meal proceeded through several courses without incident, laughter and polite conversation filling the hall as nobles toasted the king's health and expressed relief at his apparent recovery. Illyra felt her nerves stretching tighter with each passing course, wondering if perhaps Lady Muriel had grown too cautious to act tonight, if their careful plan might yield nothing after all this preparation and risk. It was during the final course, as servants brought forward a special dessert wine specifically requested by the Queen herself for the occasion, that Illyra noticed a subtle shift in Lady Muriel's demeanor. The Queen rose gracefully, lifting a goblet of the dark wine, and addressed the gathered nobles with practiced warmth. "Tonight we celebrate not only my husband's recovery," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "but the strength of our union, through such difficult trials. Allow me the honor of pouring this final toast myself, a small gesture of the devotion I have felt throughout his illness." Murmurs of approval rippled through the nobles at this seemingly touching display, but Illyra's heart pounded as she watched Lady Muriel move toward the king's goblet with a small, ornate pitcher, her hands moving with practiced grace that concealed, Illyra suspected, far more deliberate purpose than the watching nobles could perceive. Bennett, positioned close beside the king, watched every movement of the Queen's hands with careful, unwavering attention, exactly as they had planned. As Lady Muriel poured the dark wine into the king's goblet, Illyra caught the briefest flash of movement, her other hand dipping slightly toward a small ring on her finger, tilting it subtly over the goblet's rim. "Now," Illyra breathed, and beside her, Corin moved swiftly toward the king's table, exactly as they had rehearsed. "Your Majesty," Corin called out, his voice carrying clear authority despite his junior status among the physicians. "As your attending physician, I must insist on testing any new preparation before you partake, given the delicate nature of your continued recovery." A ripple of surprised murmurs passed through the hall at this seemingly presumptuous interruption. Lady Muriel's composed expression flickered, just barely, with something sharp and alarmed before she quickly recovered her gracious smile. "Surely such caution is unnecessary for a simple toast," she said smoothly, though Illyra, watching closely, caught the slight tightness in her voice. "I poured this myself, with my own hands, out of love for my husband." "Precisely why caution seems wise," Lord Halvard said, rising from his seat with deliberate calm, his voice carrying the weight of his long-standing authority within the court. A devoted wife would surely understand a physician's careful concern for her husband's continued health, particularly given how mysterious his illness proved to be these past weeks. The hall fell into tense, uncertain silence, as all eyes turned toward the small confrontation unfolding at the head table. Lady Muriel's gaze flickered briefly toward the goblet, then toward the surrounding nobles watching with growing curiosity, clearly calculating her next move with the same careful precision she had shown throughout her scheme. "Very well," she said finally, forcing her smile to remain steady. "If it eases concerns, let the physician test it as he wishes." Corin stepped forward and carefully extracted a small sample from the goblet, using a clean cloth, examining it briefly under the candlelight, before turning to address the gathered nobles directly. "This wine carries an unusual bitterness beneath its sweetness, one not typical of the vintage requested for this evening. With your Majesty's permission, I would like to test this further before the king partakes." The king, playing his role with careful precision, nodded gravely. "Given my recent illness, I believe such caution is entirely warranted. Proceed." What followed next had been carefully arranged in advance, though the assembled nobles had no knowledge of the preparation behind it. Halda herself, brought secretly into the palace earlier that day, under the guise of a visiting healer consulted for the king's continued recovery, stepped forward from where she had been waiting quietly among the physician's assistants. She examined the sample Corin provided with practiced expertise, her sharp eyes narrowing as she detected exactly what they had feared might be present. "This wine has been tainted," she announced clearly, her voice carrying the weight of professional authority that even skeptical nobles could not easily dismiss. with a substance capable of causing severe illness, potentially fatal if consumed in sufficient quantity, particularly by someone already weakened as the king has been these past weeks. Gasps and alarmed murmurs swept through the hall as the full implication of her words settled over the gathered nobles. All eyes turned toward Lady Muriel, whose carefully maintained composure finally began to crack visibly under the weight of dozens of suspicious stares. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising with genuine alarm now, rather than practiced grace. "I would never harm my own husband. Someone must have tampered with the wine before it reached me, some enemy seeking to place blame upon me for their own treachery." "And yet," Elira said, finally stepping forward from her hidden position near the kitchen, removing the plain cap that had concealed her identity throughout the evening, "we have witnessed and heard far more than a single tainted goblet tonight, Your Majesty." A collective gasp rippled through the hall at Elira's sudden, dramatic appearance, nobles turning with shocked recognition toward the disgraced former wife they had last seen humiliated and cast out weeks before. "Lady Elira," Lady Muriel said, her voice tightening with barely controlled fury beneath its forced calm. "What treachery is this?"
"You have no right to stand in this hall." "I have every right," Elira said steadily, her voice carrying clearly, despite the pounding of her own heart, "to expose the truth of what you have done to this king, and to me. I have discovered the binding you placed in his private study, weeks ago, designed to slowly weaken him toward death, while you played the role of devoted wife, before the entire court."
"I have overheard your own confession to your accomplice, discussing how you orchestrated my banishment to clear your path to this throne, and how you sought a more immediate method to finish what your binding had begun, once you suspected your scheme had been discovered." The hall erupted into chaos, nobles rising from their seats, voices raised in shock and outrage as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear before them. Lady Muriel's composure finally shattered entirely, her face twisting with fury and desperation as she realized the trap that had been so carefully constructed around her. "Lies," she shouted, though her voice carried none of its earlier confident grace. "All of this is lies, spun by a bitter, discarded woman, seeking revenge for her own failures as a wife. Enough," the king's voice cut through the chaos, carrying an authority that silenced the hall instantly, despite his continued appearance of weakness. He rose slowly from his seat, his eyes fixed on Lady Muriel, with an expression of cold, controlled fury that finally revealed the strength he had carefully concealed throughout the evening's careful performance. "I have heard enough tonight to understand the truth of what has been done to me, and to Elira before me. Guards, seize the queen immediately, and search her private chambers thoroughly. I want every detail of this conspiracy uncovered before the sun rises tomorrow." As palace guards moved swiftly to restrain the shouting, struggling queen, dragging her from the hall despite her furious protests and denials, the assembled nobles turned toward Elira with expressions no longer filled with mockery or scorn, but with growing understanding, and in many faces, genuine shame for how readily they had once dismissed and humiliated her. Elira stood quietly amid the chaos, watching as the woman who had orchestrated her downfall was finally, publicly exposed before the very court that had once celebrated her rise to power, feeling a complicated mixture of vindication and exhaustion settle over her after weeks of careful, dangerous work finally reaching its conclusion. The days following that chaotic dinner unfolded quickly, the palace consumed with the scandal of the queen's exposed treachery. A thorough search of Lady Muriel's private chambers uncovered further evidence of her conspiracy, including correspondence detailing her arrangement with the robed scholar, a man quickly identified and apprehended attempting to flee the city, whose testimony under formal questioning confirmed every detail of the scheme Elira and Corin had uncovered. The full truth emerged gradually over the following week. Lady Muriel had arrived at court over a year earlier, with carefully calculated ambition, recognizing in the king a path toward power she had long sought through more legitimate means without success. She had orchestrated Elira's downfall through careful manipulation, planting doubts in the king's mind about Elira's worth and loyalty, through subtle rumors and manufactured evidence, patiently building toward the public humiliation that would clear her path to the throne. Once secured as queen, she had begun the slow binding illness, intending to weaken the king gradually, before eventually inheriting control of the kingdom through his prolonged incapacitation or eventual death, all while maintaining the appearance of a devoted, grieving wife. The formal trial that followed was swift and thorough, conducted before the full assembly of the court with testimony from Alira, Corin, Bennett, Lord Halvard, and Halda, whose expertise in identifying the binding and poison proved crucial in establishing the undeniable truth of the conspiracy. Lady Muriel, stripped of her title and privileges, offered no genuine remorse throughout the proceedings, her fury at being discovered evident in every defiant word she spoke before the court finally rendered its judgment, sentencing her to permanent exile from the kingdom, stripped of all rank and connection to the royal family she had sought to destroy from within. Alira attended the trial each day, watching as the woman who had orchestrated her public humiliation finally faced consequences for her cruelty and ambition. She found, to her own surprise, that the satisfaction she had expected to feel proved more complicated than simple vindication, tempered by exhaustion and the lingering weight of everything she had endured throughout the ordeal. In the weeks that followed the trial, the king summoned Alira to a private audience, a stark contrast to the public humiliation of their last formal meeting in that same great hall. He received her not from his high seat, but standing, meeting her at eye level, with a humility she had never witnessed from him during their years of marriage. "I owe you a debt I can never fully repay," he said quietly, once the attending servants had been dismissed, leaving them alone in the quiet chamber. "You risked everything, your safety, your reputation, to save a man who had shown you nothing but cruelty and public disgrace. I do not understand how you found the strength for such mercy. I did not do it entirely for you," Alira said honestly, echoing words she had spoken weeks before in his sick room. "I did it because allowing such treachery to succeed, unchallenged, felt like a betrayal of everything I believe a just kingdom should stand for. And because I needed, for my own sake, to understand the truth of what had been done to me." The king nodded slowly, studying her with an expression that held genuine respect, rather than the dismissive coldness she remembered from their marriage. "I would like to offer you restoration of your former title," he said. "A formal acknowledgement before the full court of the wrong done to you, and an invitation to return to this palace with the honor and respect you were always owed." Alira considered his offer carefully, weighing the words with the same thoughtful deliberation she had applied to every decision throughout her long, difficult journey. "I am grateful for the offer, Your Majesty," she said finally, "and for your acknowledgement of the wrong done to me, but I find I no longer wish to return to the life I once led within these palace walls." Surprise flickered across the king's features. "May I ask why?" "Because I have discovered something these past weeks that I value more than any title this court could offer me," Alira said, her voice steady with newfound conviction. "I have discovered purpose and skill and the genuine respect of people who value me for what I can offer, rather than for the political convenience of my birth. I would like to continue the work I began during this ordeal, studying the old healing knowledge my grandmother once taught me, perhaps alongside Corin and Halda, helping those who cannot afford or access the physicians within these palace walls." The king studied her for a long moment, something like admiration, slowly replacing the surprise in his expression. "Then I will not press you to accept a title you no longer desire," he said, "but know that you will always have my gratitude and my support in whatever path you choose to pursue. And should you ever require anything within my power to grant, you need only ask." Alira nodded, a genuine unburdened smile finally crossing her features for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Thank you, Your Majesty. That is more than I ever expected to receive from this court." In the months that followed, Alira established a small healing practice at the edge of the capital, working alongside Corin, who had earned rapid promotion within the palace physician's ranks, following his crucial role in exposing the queen's treachery, and Hulda, whose knowledge finally received the recognition it had long deserved, rather than dismissal as mere superstition. Together, they built something neither title nor court favor could have granted, a place where the old healing knowledge and new medical understanding worked together to help those the grand palace had long overlooked. Word of Alira's role in exposing the queen's conspiracy spread throughout the kingdom, transforming the story once told with mockery and scorn, the tale of a discarded, humiliated wife, into a story of quiet courage and unexpected redemption. Nobles who had once laughed at her public disgrace now spoke her name with respect, some even seeking her counsel on matters of health and old knowledge that the university-trained physicians still struggled to fully understand. Illyra did not seek out this newfound respect, finding far greater satisfaction in the quiet work of healing than in the fickle favor of a court she had learned to view with clear, unclouded eyes. She visited the king occasionally, their relationship settling into something neither of them could have predicted on the day of her humiliating banishment. A careful, respectful friendship, built on shared history and hard-won understanding, rather than the political convenience that had first brought them together. Standing one evening at the edge of her small garden, watching the sun set behind the distant palace towers that had once represented everything cruel and dismissive in her life, Illyra found herself reflecting on the strange, difficult path that had led her to this quiet, purposeful place. She had entered that great hall months before, as a woman stripped of everything she believed defined her worth, cast aside before a mocking court with nothing but the clothes on her back. She had left that same palace, months later, having uncovered a truth that saved a kingdom's rightful king, exposed a dangerous conspiracy that would have otherwise succeeded unchallenged, and discovered, in the process, a version of herself far stronger and more capable than the discarded, humiliated wife the court had once dismissed so cruelly. The title she had lost that terrible day no longer mattered to her, not truly. What mattered was the quiet, steady respect she had earned through her own courage and skill. The genuine friendships forged through shared danger and purpose, and the knowledge that when the kingdom had needed truth most desperately, she had been the one brave enough to find it, and strong enough to see it through to its rightful conclusion. As darkness settled fully over the city, Illyra turned from her garden and returned inside, where a line of patients still waited patiently for her evening consultations, people who valued her, not for the title she had lost, but for the healer and the woman she had chosen, through her own hard-won strength, to become.